Today what we're going to be looking at is a series of stories, and in the middle we'll have a look at a bit of Bible passage. But I want us to look at some stories and think about the different worldviews that they represent, and what a Christian worldview would look like with regards to that. I'm a fan of the Amish in some ways. They've decided that modern inventions are the tool of the devil, that people were meant to work hard physically in order to survive. When you think about it, with all of our modern conveniences, do we have a lot more leisure time than our grandparents did? No, we've just filled up our leisure time with the expectation now that women will work full-time as well as men, in spite of the fact they still have to run their households as well. And all of this happens, and we just get busier, don't we? They work from dawn till dark, but they don't have electricity, so they can't turn on the lights at dark and keep on going. They use candles or they go to bed. They will, however, use electricity in the barns because the government has said that they won't buy their milk unless they actually have it cooled to a certain temperature within a certain number of minutes after it actually being milked. So they have electricity in the barns to operate the refrigeration system. They don't use cars, but if someone is really sick, they will call an ambulance, but they'll have to go to a next door neighbor that's not Amish because they don't actually have a phone. They don't use buttons because buttons have something to do with military, and they have nothing to do with the military. They practice sustainable farming and cooperatively can their produce, quilt a blanket, and raise a barn or a house in very short order. No makeup, no dancing, no electronic devices. Instead, they have community and hard work, fresh homemade bread, and hearty sleep. Unfortunately, their theology is not very good. They think that they can earn their way to heaven by being good. But when you think about their lifestyle, there's something attractive about it, isn't there? If you stop and think for a while of what this lifestyle would entail, you can sort of feel the ground moving under your feet as you think through what it would mean to live in that sort of a society. The gospel is a bit that way too, that it moves the ground under your feet and makes you think about things a little bit differently. At every turn, the Bible is saying something odd, something that jars with the world that we live in. Love your enemies. How countercultural is that? Some of us can't manage to love our husbands and our children, let alone love our enemies. I have come for the sinners and not for the righteous. What does this mean, Jesus? I thought my good father was a Christian, and that you possibly couldn't want to have anything to do with me. I'm a rebellious little worm, not fit to be shown attention by the God of the entire universe. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it. Haven't we all seen people become absolutely obsessive about things that they think will prolong their lives and give it some meaning? Whether it is rescuing some tribal group by buying fair trade coffee, or going vegan to promote a healthy lifestyle, or building bigger houses to accommodate our expanding lifestyles. Now, there's nothing wrong with any one of those things in itself. But when they become an obsession, we end up spending our lives on them. And it's easy then to miss what we're actually here for. Rick Warren, in his book, talks about there's only two things that we can do here on earth that we cannot do in the life to come. Those two things are we can sin and we can tell other people about Jesus. Neither of those two things will we do once Jesus comes back again. Now, what do you suppose we're here for? Which one of those? If we lose our lives to the gospel, we lose it to the plan and purpose of God who is bigger than all of us. And what we do then has eternal significance. That has to have first priority in our lives. To lead, you must be the servant of all, like your Savior. Remember the night that he washed his disciples' feet. Have you ever stopped to think about what that day represented for him? After a full day of preaching and talking to people, he then celebrated the Passover with his disciples, and from there he went to the garden and was arrested, and from there he went on to the cross. In the middle of this very, very busy day that doesn't end until his life ends, he takes time to stop and wash his disciples' feet to show that in order to be one of his disciples, you have to become the servant of all. I think that we see this in believers today. For an example, that where you look at the same believers who will say that homosexuality is not an acceptable lifestyle are the palliative care nurses in the AIDS wards ministering to homosexuals who are dying alone. This is working towards a Christian lifestyle and a Christian worldview. I've recently saw this film, The End of the Spear. It's a film version of Jim Elliot's life and death. Jim Elliot and his 4 friends, with their young families, moved to Ecuador in order to minister to the Auca Indians when they were still unreached and very savage people. I found one scene very moving in the film. Just before he goes to have his first face-to-face encounter with the Aucas, Jim stands in front of his young son, who is worried that his dad is going to die at the hands of the Auca Indians. His son knows that he's packed his handgun and asks if he will use that gun against the Aucas if they come at him with their spears to kill him. What would you say? Does he have the right to kill someone who is intent on killing him? Does turning the other cheek include a spear that goes through your body? Jim's answer to his son was that he knows Jesus and he's ready to die, and the Aucas are not ready. If he kills them, then they will go to hell. If he gets killed, he will be sad to leave his family and his life, but he'll be with Jesus. He then turns to get onto the plane that will take him to his death, while his son watches on, worried that he will never see him again. Run that through our selfish, vigilante-oriented worldview. Could you stand in front of your son and say that you would sooner die than kill someone who deserved to die? Tolerance isn't exactly what it used to be anymore. A Muslim girl in my Year 11 Bible class a few years ago told me that she listened to me politely and with respect, assuming that she would find something correct in what I was saying. She said that she felt that I didn't treat her with the same respect, and that I assumed that her religion was wrong and that I was not tolerant of her. I assured her that I always listened respectfully and that I would back her right to believe anything that she wanted to believe, but that the Bible said that she was wrong, that there is only one way to heaven, and that's through Jesus. I told her it would be easier for me to tell her what she wanted to hear, to tell her that her belief system was as coherent as mine, and we would just agree to be different and we'd both be heaven-bound. But I can't say that, because your eternal life is at stake if I do. And that's what I'm here for, to make sure that she hears the gospel, so that she has an option. Tolerance isn't what it used to be. Tolerance used to mean that you were free to believe anything that you wanted to believe, even if it was wrong or silly. You see the slide that's up ahead of the boats that are falling off the end of the world. There still is a flat earth society, people that believe that the earth is flat. Very silly people, but they have a right to believe what they want to believe. Today, tolerance means that everyone should grant that all views have equal value and that no viewpoint is the truth. To say that something is truth is tantamount to saying that someone might be wrong, and that has become intolerable in our society. I have a mother at school, a Vietnamese lady, who has come to see me a couple of times because she thinks that Australians are very naive And she is worried about who is allowed to come to both her and my adopted country. Are we naive when we celebrate the diversity of the culture that we are developing as different nationalities join us? Do we fail to perceive the agendas that they bring with them? Do we fail to consider what these various peoples, how they're going to change our country? And where does the gospel fit into all of that? Isn't it easier to evangelize the nations when we bring them here to our shore? While we don't want to be naive, should we be concerned about the agendas that other cultures and faiths bring to Australia? Isn't God in his heaven laughing at the plans of his enemies? Doesn't he have a plan of his own in bringing each of us to the place that we are, where we can hear about his love for us in sending Jesus? And how will those cultures change our own? We had a Burmese man who came and stayed with us for a while. David and some of his friends have been to Myanmar a few times to preach in their various Bible colleges. And this was one of the men that they had met while they were over there who had wanted to do some publishing. And so he was coming to Australia and wanted to spend some time with us. I'll never forget the first meal that I cooked him. I thought I'd done really well. Chicken in this spicy sauce and rice and vegetables. And I put it in front of him and he took one look at it and he goes, "What is that?" I said to him that it was a chicken breast. And he looked at me in absolute disbelief and laughed. This huge piece of meat was a chicken breast. And he was expected to eat the entire thing himself. He raised his own chickens. And he'd never seen anything like it. He wanted to meet this chook. Having him stay with us was a challenge to our worldview in many respects, and no doubt to his as well. Towards the end of his stay, we talked about the role of women in the household, because I'd heard stories about how his family had treated David when they were there, and how his wife and the children were in the kitchen and they would serve the men, and then after the men had eaten, then they would sit down and they would eat. And he found the idea that this Western woman who had more independence than he was used to seeing, who sat and ate with her husband and the guest, but who still respected her husband and worked for him as well as with him. Wouldn't it be good if we had an argument that could convince everyone that Jesus died in their place so that they could have a relationship with God now and forever? How do we go about answering people who think that we just don't get it, that it's the 21st century and it's rude to say that our way is right? We keep forgetting to say, "right for me." What about all of those who believe something else? How can we offend them by saying that we are right and they are wrong? Josh McDowell explains, we pointed out that numerous Bible passages which long puzzled the commentators have readily yielded up their meaning when light from archaeological discoveries has been focused on them. So we find there are passages in the Bible that people haven't understood, but when archaeology gets to work and does some digging around, sometimes they can come up with these really interesting things that help us to understand bits of the Bible. When we were at seminary, there was a classic case that came up. There was in the Bible, it talks about a king of Assyria that's called Pul. And we have the lists of the Assyrian kings, and Pul does not appear on the list of the Assyrian kings. And so there were scholars who poo-pooed the people who actually believed the Bible and said, look, this is proof. We have a list of the Assyrian kings, and that guy's not on the list. Until one day, they dug up a letter. And the letter was written from a nephew to Tiglath-Pileser, who is on the Assyrian list. And he starts off his letter, "Dear Uncle Pulu." And you go, all right. So the Bible writers not only knew who the king was, but they knew his family name, because probably they worked in the household. Similarly, when we went to Israel, we got some very interesting insight into the whole idea of Jesus' birth. You know how it says that there was no room for him in the inn? And we all have this idea in our brains of a motel with a flashing light saying, no vacancy. If we stop and think for a minute, what was the culture in those days and what actually happened, then we would have a very different picture. Because if you lived in the Middle East and you went to another town which was actually back to where you started from, who would you stay with? Your relatives, of course. There's no question about that. And the room that they had out the front, that they reserved for serving meals and for guests if they came, has the same name as the word that's used in the Bible for inn. It's not really an inn, it's a guest room. Yeah? Oh, that makes sense, doesn't it? So they came to town along with everybody else that was related to them, because you remember, everybody had to go back to their hometown. You go back to your hometown, and everybody's guest room's full because all the relatives have filled them up. That makes sense, doesn't it? But next door to the room that you use, this is the room that they would use for sitting around, and in the evening the children would go to bed in that room. But you see the little hole that goes through? On the other side of that is this room. This room in winter is full of the sheep. That's where they stay. But in summer, it's where you do all of your shelling of the peas, or grinding up of corn or maize to make flours and that sort of thing. So that's the room that's next to it. And it's the room that you would normally have your animals in. That's the room where Jesus was born. Not that specific one, but it was in that kind of a room where Jesus was born, next to the main house. It's an interesting way to think about it, right? When you see something in the archaeology that comes up with, oh, that makes a lot more sense than the idea that I have in my brain of the no vacancy sign blinking. The other one that I wanted to talk about is the one that we read this morning, the story that we read. We read the Bible's account, but we also have Xerxes' account of what happened on that night. And he says that while Belshazzar was planning his next campaign, and he had all of his nobles with him, and yes, it had degenerated into a party by the time that the end of the evening had come, they thought that their town was totally impregnable. It stood on the very flat plain, and there's Babylon right in the middle of it. And they thought that nobody was going to go and to interfere with them, because there was no way to get in without everybody seeing. You have a couple of people that are posted up and that as guards on the top, and that was enough to guard it, because it was virtually impregnable. But Xerxes was a very tricky man, and he marched his soldiers through the sewerage pipe for miles and miles and miles, and they came up into the room where they were having this banquet, and that was the first they knew that they were around. And that was the night that he defeated them. Do you notice in the story that we read that Daniel tells the king he can keep his presence? Don't make me third in the kingdom. I don't want that. Why? He knows it's going to last about 20 minutes. And this guy's going to pop through the floor. Evidence. Evidence is a really useful thing for us, but mostly it's useful for people who are already believers. It helps us, it confirms what we believe, it helps us to see the logic and the truth in what we believe. Very rarely is it a good tool to use for unbelievers to bring them to Christ, because they often don't want to, because they already have ideas as to what's happening there. In writing the foreword to the book Evidence Demands a Verdict, Harold Fickett says, I make bold to say that no intelligent person can read this with an open mind without coming to the conclusion that Jesus Christ is the unique Son of God and man's only sufficient Savior. Does anyone see a problem with that statement? Who comes with an open mind? We each bring our own presuppositions with us, and we put the world around us through our sieve of presuppositions, and we usually find what we're already convinced is there. I'll tell you a story that's not my original. Once upon a time, there was a man who thought he was dead. His concerned family and friends sent him to the friendly neighborhood psychiatrist. The psychiatrist was determined that he was going to cure this man, and he tried one way and another to convince him that this was not the case. Finally, he decided that he would try to use the simple truth that dead men do not bleed. So he put his patient to work, reading medical texts and observing autopsies and various other things. After weeks of effort, the patient finally agreed, "All right, you've convinced me, dead men do not bleed." Whereupon the psychiatrist stuck him in the arm with a needle and the blood flowed. The man looked down with a contorted, ashen face and cried, "Good grief, dead men bleed after all." We are committed to our presuppositions. The problem was that he had his presupposition that he was already dead. Similarly, the unbeliever wants to argue from a point of assuming there is no God. We cannot start at that point and then argue God into existence. We, like the unbeliever, argue from our presuppositions, and it's only on our presuppositions that the world makes sense, because God made it that way. The unbeliever must break into irrationalism at some point in his construction of his worldview, because the world doesn't work the way that his presuppositions put it together. So, like John Cage that we talked about a few weeks ago, who does not gather mushrooms as randomly as he plucks his notes out of the air. We need to look for those areas where people are inconsistent with their worldview and use that to point them to Christ. When Jesus was here on earth, he tells the story of the rich man and Lazarus and what happened to them when they died. Lazarus, who had been a poor beggar, but who believed in God and his promises, enjoying heaven, while the rich man who had ignored Lazarus' plight here on earth, suffering in hell. Having established that Lazarus could not pop in with some cool water for him, he asks Abraham for another favor. He answered, "I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." He said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." Now you have to catch the irony of this statement. Made by Christ towards the end of his time on earth. He is about to die, and he knows that his resurrection is not going to be an overwhelming proof to everybody in the world that he is God. They will find a way to dismiss what is happening in front of them because it doesn't fit their worldview. So we have people who claim that the guards move his body, that his disciples stole the body. "Oh, you looked in the wrong tomb." Or the crowd that saw him after his death were experiencing some kind of mass hysteria. Or maybe he only swooned and wasn't really dead in the first place. People don't rise from the dead is a presupposition that many people are committed to. Oh, and the aside, we should have gotten rid of Lazarus while we had the chance. People don't rise from the dead. Don't be silly. And look at the strength of that presupposition still in play today. Those excuses that we hear that people made in the first century are still being made today. So what is happening? Why can't reasonable, rational people see that the Lord our God, the Lord is one, that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life? I want us to look at Romans 1 for a little while and work our way through this section of Romans. Romans 1 verse 18. "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness." When we look around at our world, we not only see the effects of our great Creator, but we also see the effects of sin. We can see on the one hand that God is mighty and powerful and the things that he makes are awesome. And on the other hand, particularly when you look at something like the bushfires raging around, God is a scary person. We cannot control him, and we can see he's not happy. There's something wrong, and we're part of the problem. If you don't know the Bible, and you've never heard the story of Jesus, you don't know how to deal with an angry God. You don't know how to control him, and so you suppress the truth that you know that there is a God, so that you don't have to deal with this God who is angry. Verse 19, since what can be known about God is plain to them, God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. God is a marvelous creator, and we see his design in all of creation. As we look around at the variety and the complexity of the world, as we look at ourselves in the mirror and wonder at how fabulously our bodies heal, and at the amount of information that we can store and even retrieve sometimes, we all know that God exists and that he created. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. And although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. Now think about that for a minute. It's understandable to an extent. If they don't know what to do about their position before God, they rationalize their way out of it. In so doing, they postulate that the world works in ways that God didn't design it to work in. And so they become foolish because they've put another way of working over top of it. It's like refusing to drive and maintain your Toyota according to the maker's instructions. It leads to problems. It doesn't work properly if you do that. And it's the same when we don't work according to God's instructions. He has made this world, he's left us with instructions of how things will work best. If we choose to ignore that, we shouldn't be surprised if things don't work out well. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. What else do people worship instead of God? Themselves, or anything they can lay their hands on. Something that they can have control over, not someone who wants them to abandon themselves to him. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever praised. So we have in our society today the mantra that everyone lies. And sadly, it has become a way of life for many people. I remember many years ago writing an article for our school newsletter on not wanting to live in a world where everybody lied to me, but watching as the culture around us has got us to a point where virtually that is where we live, in a place where people do not tell the truth, where truth is not valued and not believed and not searched for with any validity, but instead people are looking for a truth that they know they cannot find. David once had an interesting conversation with a professor in a university in Melbourne. He wanted to sign up to do a course, and the fellow told him that as long as David thought that he knew the truth, that he would never sign him up to do a course with him because he was a dogmatist, and he wasn't, that searching for the truth was a noble thing to do, but we know we can't find it. If you think that you found it, then you are in the wrong place. And you go, that is really an interesting worldview, isn't it, to put through that. Please go to the next one. Because of this, God gave them over to shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. In the same way, men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed indecent act with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their perversion. Furthermore, since they didn't think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, he gave them over to a depraved mind to do what ought not to be done. There are two kinds of people in the world. Don't you love that beginning. Those who say, "Thy will be done," to God, and those to whom God says, "Have it your own way then." I like that. If humans insist on not worshiping God, then it is a natural next step that impurity will follow. Because if they're going to have it their own way, that's the way that it will go. And further, they have become filled with every kind of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. They're full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. They are senseless, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Does that not sound like the society that we're becoming? Many of those things we actually applaud these days as being a good thing. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but approve of those who practice them, as evidenced by our ubiquitous T-shirt slogans, many of which condone wrong practices and wrong thinking. How do we use the presuppositions that people bring into the arena to show them that they actually do know that there is a God, and in fact that they know the only living and true God? When we look at Romans 1, we see that the people's natural reaction to seeing that God is angry and not knowing what to do about it is to suppress the story and about why he is angry and invent another story that they can control. However, there are chinks in the armor, places where they show their true colors, and these are the bits that we as evangelists want to find so that we can show their inconsistencies and point them to the Creator, to their Creator and Savior. Let's work through some stories, okay? Harvey Kahn was our apologetics lecturer at Westminster Seminary, and he once opened the doors of the apologetics class to the lions outside and showed us Daniels how to tame them. He invited a lady to join the class, amongst others, who was an avowed atheist, and he interviewed her briefly about her atheism, and then about her family, and then about her other interests in life. This was in the 1970s, and she was a legal rights for tenants activist, which in Philadelphia was a very worthy cause. The center of Philadelphia was full of high-rise apartment blocks, and people would work them through, would buy up an entire apartment block and then refuse to do anything about repairs or maintenance. And Philadelphia gets very cold in the winter, so that was an important thing, that things like heaters work. And they would watch as the place deteriorated and as the clientele of the place deteriorated. And when it got to a certain point where it was either going to cost them a lot of money to do it up, then they would hire people to come by, and they used to call it white lightning. They'd come in and they'd burn the place down. No notice given, just burn it down. Then you'd level it off and turn it into a parking lot. Charge people money to park there. This was a regular thing that happened in Philadelphia. Harvey's friend was indignant about this situation and railed on about it. Harvey stopped her and asked her, why is it wrong? On her view, there's no God, therefore no absolutes in the world. We're only flotsam and jetsam floating on a shoreless, bottomless ocean. Why is anything right or wrong? He said he agreed that there were things that were innately right. He said that he agreed with her that there are things that are innately right or wrong. But the reason that there are things that are innately right and wrong is because there is an absolute God. And we are his image. We are moral creatures who think and reason and reflect what God is like. Remember, distorted, but image of God. That gives us a point of contact to talk to our friends and our neighbors about. When you look at what they're passionate about, that indicates that they really are still aware of the image of God in them and work through on those sorts of things. Another story involves a year 12 student who describes himself as a neo-pagan. which means that he is into ancient pagan religions, according to his current whim or reading or thoughts or whatever he's doing. He worships the Greek goddess Diana. He believes the pyramids possibly came from aliens. He doesn't like the Bible because it encourages people to think that there is only one way, and he cannot believe that there is only one way and that all other religions in the world are just wrong. He and I have had quite lengthy discussions, nearly weekly, both in class and on paper, as he writes excellent questions in his journal regarding his Bible readings. We've both enjoyed the intellectual stimulation of the sparring, and I have read some of the stuff that he's into too, so that we can have a fuller discussion on them. In one of our more recent discussions, I suggested that he didn't have the right to judge God, who is his creator, that he actually didn't have any measuring tool that would suffice for that task. Suddenly a few pennies dropped for him, and he responded rather incredulously, "So how do you regard me then? Do you see me as an idolater?" See his allegiance to his independence? His ego was hurt because he thought we were intellectuals having an academic discussion, and all of a sudden he saw that there was a personal aspect to this. I told him, yes, he was an idolater, not my opinion, but by biblical definition, but that was a typical sin for unbelievers, and there was a cure. Pray for me as I answer journal questions for students like him. I'll tell you another story. This is a very sad story. Many of you would know the story of Apollo 13 because you've seen the film, rather than because you actually have one of those, I know where I was when that happened moments, which I do. But then I'm a bit older than most of you. Apollo 13 was the third manned mission of the Apollo space program that actually was going to land on the moon. They launched in April of 1970, and then they had to abort the lunar landing because they had an explosion in the craft. One of the oxygen tanks exploded. Then they suddenly had a problem, and the problem was that they had to fix something with the limited things they had on board the spaceship. They had to be able to fix a problem that they had, or they weren't going to be able to land. So you have people that are floating around in space with no way of getting back again. At that point, the American Congress issued a decree calling on Americans to pray for the safety of these people. And in God's grace, they figured out how to fix it. And if you've seen the movie, you know what they went through in order to do that. But then Richard Nixon, who was the president at the time, presented the Medal of Freedom to the missions operation team, and this is what he said. "We often speak of scientific miracles, forgetting that these are not miraculous happenings at all, but rather the product of hard work, long hours, and disciplined intelligence. The men and women of the Apollo 13 mission operations team performed such a miracle, transforming potential tragedy into one of the most dramatic rescues of all time. Years of intense preparation made this rescue possible. The skill, coordination, and performance under the pressure of the missions operation team made it happen. 3 brave astronauts are alive and on Earth because of their dedication, and because at the critical moment, the people of that team were wise enough and self-possessed enough to make the right decisions. Their extraordinary feat is a tribute to man's ingenuity, to his resourcefulness, and to his courage." How about that? It's enough to make you weep, isn't it? When you ask people to pray and then say it wasn't God who did it, that God didn't have a hand in it. I'll tell you one more story, and with this story we're going to finish our session this morning. I have a friend who never ceases to amaze me with the people with whom she comes into contact and to befriend. Let me introduce you to one of her more recent friends, whom I'll call Lucy. Hi. I'm married to Daniel. When we got married, I was 7 months pregnant to another man. When my baby was born, docs wouldn't let me take the baby out of the hospital, but took the child away from me on the day that I was due to go home. I was devastated. If you do the least thing wrong, docs takes away your kids. I know that. They have my other 2 children as well. Daniel has 2 beautiful little daughters. They're both preschoolers. He has shared access to them, and he goes to stay at his parents' place for a couple of days when he has access to them, because we live far away from them. He loves them to bits, and they are gorgeous little girls. His ex-wife left him for his best friend, with whom she has recently had a baby, but the best friend is gone. I'm worried about Daniel's daughters. I'm sure they're jealous of their little brother, and I'm sure they don't understand about Daniel's best friend coming into the household and then leaving again. Daniel's ex has put some stuff up on Facebook about these girls and about how they wash dishes and they sweep the living room and they think it's a game. It's terrible that they would think that way. She shouldn't be putting them to work. They're just children. That's child abuse. I talked it over with Daniel, and he agreed with me. These kids are too young to have to work. And so the next time that Daniel had access to the kids, we didn't return the girls. We brought them home to our place. And we're going to put a claim together on the girls. We want them to come and live with us so they can have a stable family life. Where do you begin to talk to this person about the gospel? You see her longing for family, her longing for a stable family life. There's something in that, I think, that you could build on to talk to her about the gospel. And my friend is amazing at doing exactly that sort of thing. Unbiblical worldviews don't have to be scientific or rational. But our job as believers is to unpack our own and others' worldviews and to put them under the scrutiny of the Bible, and then to work at modeling Christ-likeness, being brave enough to talk to those who don't know God, to use their inconsistencies, the places where they show themselves to truly be the image of God, and to use those inconsistencies to introduce them to their Creator, who has a claim on them and who loves them dearly and has sent Jesus to die in their place. Pray that God will put each of us in the position to do this, and have fun practicing.